Hello and welcome back. This is the week 3 lecture. So now we move on to our third film of the semester, which is Raising Arizona, directed by Joel Cohen and written by both Joel and Ethan Cohen. The two of them are known to us collectively as the Coen brothers. That's sort of the colloquial term that we use to refer to them. But generally, Joel gets the directing credits on their films, and they usually co-write the screenplays. Meanwhile, Ethan often will have a role as a producer, one of many producers generally on their film. So they do sort of have distinctive, well-defined roles within the production of their films, but we often just think of them as a singular entity, the Coen brothers. So they're pretty famous, as most of us probably know. I'm guessing a lot of you have probably seen at least some of their films, or at least heard of some of their films. So this was their second film. Raising Arizona came out in 1987. Their debut film, Blood Simple, came out in 1984. So we'll talk a little bit about Blood Simple today. So that one sort of got them on the map. It got them some attention. It was a hit. Critics really liked it, thought it was stylish, skillfully done. So it kind of got them on the map. And this is their sophomore film. This is their follow-up, their second feature. For the most part, Raising Arizona was pretty popular and well received. But as we'll talk about a little bit later, it got some negative reviews as well. Some people were a little bit on the fence about it. People liked certain qualities pretty much across the board, but there were some criticisms. There was sort of the thought that maybe this film is mostly style and not very much substance. So we can talk a little bit about that today. And I want to talk a little bit about the evolution of the Coen brothers style, because I think at least some of us, or maybe a lot of us, have seen enough of their work to have some idea or some general impression of like what a Coen brothers movie is like or what it's supposed to be like. And I think Raising Arizona fits pretty well within those confines, but I think we'll also see that the Coen brothers do a lot of different things, and they can't really be pinned down with just sort of one definition, one style, one register or tone. So after this film, they sort of grew in popularity and their mainstream appeal increased. So once we get into the 90s, they start making some pretty big films. Miller's Crossing comes out in 1990. It's a lot like Blood Simple, kind of a throwback to old film noirs, sort of a crime drama. In the case of Miller's Crossing, it's like, I think, Prohibition era gangsters. It's kind of what it's about. So they work within that genre quite a bit. That movie was successful. And then in 1996, Fargo comes out. A lot of us might be familiar with that. Even if you haven't seen the film, that's one of those movies that kind of lives on in our popular culture, even if we don't directly consume the text. I talked about that some in my 451 class with sort of classic American authors like Melville and Poe, who not everybody reads anymore, but you at least know who they are. And you know Moby Dick, and you know The Raven, right? You know some of their most famous texts. You at least know of them, even if you've never actually read them. I would argue that Fargo kind of occupies a similar role if we're thinking about late 20th century cinema. It lives on. There's a TV series now based on it, which I think is quite different, really, than the Coen brothers movie, but certain aspects of that story sort of endure, even though our culture has changed a lot in the 25 years since the film came out. And then, of course, in 98, they come out with The Big Lebowski. A lot of us are probably familiar with that movie. Again, even if you haven't seen it, you probably know people who have seen it. You've heard it referenced in other places. It kind of lives on. In the year 2000, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? That's another very popular Coen brothers film. Going up to 2007, No Country for Old Men. They did that. That's an adaptation of a novel by Cormac McCarthy. That's one of my favorites of theirs. A much more somber version of the Coens, although we still have humor in that film. But again, they're kind of returning to their film noir crime drama roots with that adaptation. That's very much the milieu that they're working in. The very next year, they do Burn After Reading, which is a much more goofy sort of tone to that one. In 2010, they do their remake of True Grit, a classic U.S. Western film, originally starring John Wayne. They sort of update it. I mean, they're very true to the novel that the original movie's based on. So there's, the time period's the same. A lot of the, core elements of the story are the same, but they're making it, I would argue, with more modern sensibilities. Jeff Bridges, Matt Damon, Haley Steinfeld, who's become kind of a big actor slash singer. She was still just a kid in that role, so she sort of got big in part because of that. 2013, Inside Llewyn Davis, starring Oscar Isaac, kind of a satirical look at the folk rock scene in New York City in the early 60s. Hail Caesar in 2016, a wonderful sort of send-up of the golden age of Hollywood, starring George Clooney. That's another one of my favorites. And then The Ballad of Buster Scruggs came out in 2018, and they're kind of spoofing and having fun with Westerns once again, which they do multiple times throughout their careers. So they've had a long sort of shared career. I think Joel's kind of branching out and doing something on his own right now. I haven't seen it myself, but I understand that he's directing the new version of Macbeth, starring Denzel Washington. That's now, I think, available through Apple TV, but I'm not really sure. I haven't seen it, but I think Joel's doing that solo. I don't think Ethan's necessarily involved in that, but of course, throughout their careers, they pretty much always work together. So again, they're famous. I think we're on pretty familiar ground here. Unlike Jarmusch and Sherwood, the first two directors we've looked at, the Coen brothers are known, right? They're not just popular in like film nerd circles. They're not just big in the indie film world. And that's part of what I want to talk about today, is how they sort of transcend that barrier, how they sort of move from the indie world. But pretty early on, they sort of make their move to a more sort of mainstream avenue of filmmaking. Not to say that their movies are necessarily mainstream in a typical way. I mean, like we're going to see, they're quirky, they're offbeat, their stuff is often weird. But just if we're thinking a little bit about that business model that we've been talking about throughout the semester, they make an early transition from just sort of working with independent film companies sort of outside the confines of Hollywood. And with this film, they sort of make that leap into more of the Hollywood arena. So I just wanted to connect us back to what we were talking about last week with Parting Glances, and we read about the role that Pearson plays in getting that film bought and distributed. He basically helps to sell it to a distribution company. He certainly takes a lot of credit for making that happen. So in the process of explaining that, he's kind of telling us a larger history about this move that a lot of major Hollywood studios make in the 80s. They're starting to read the tea leaves, or however you want to put it. They're starting to see that the industry is changing. It's becoming a little bit more fractured. It's becoming kind of more diverse in certain ways. There's more kinds of movies, different kinds of movies, different voices, I think, as we've already begun to see. So a lot of these big studios, like Pearson tells us, they start to establish sort of indie branches or indie arms of their larger studio that sort of specialize in European art cinema and independent U.S. cinema. Basically finding these movies, buying them, and in many cases then distributing them. So a lot of times these studios aren't going to be directly involved in the production, but they're going to swoop in after the movie's been made, buy it, and distribute it, give it a theatrical release, create an audience, and make it possible for that movie to then be successful. So like I was saying last week, in some cases, the studios create like subsidiaries or branches that might, in some cases, cover production and distribution, or they might have separate entities. One does production, one does distribution. In other cases, they were just setting up distribution companies. They weren't really in on the production side of things at all. Like I was just saying, they would just buy up the independently made movies and give them bigger releases than they could have ever hoped to have otherwise. So there were slightly different ways of doing this, and like Pearson says, some of these companies that started out as offshoots of the big studios like United Artists, a lot of those big studios created little branches or like arms to do this kind of work, and in some cases some of those companies could kind of split off, become independent, become autonomous. In other cases, they were always owned by the big studio, but they were at least allowed to sort of operate in a slightly autonomous way without maybe a ton of oversight from the studio sort of, brass. They were sort of allowed to do their own thing, find these offbeat movies, buy them, and then figure out what to do with them. So that's kind of what's happening throughout the decade, and it's just interesting to think about the Coen brothers within that context. So just to take a moment to talk about the business side before we get into the artistic side, what the Coens did with their first film, with Blood Simple, they ended up selling that to a distribution company. So Circle Films was a sort of independent company. At least they were separate from the major Hollywood machinery. So the Coens sold their first film to Circle Films, but specifically to Circle Releasing Company, which was the distribution side of that company. So Circle Films sort of had a production side and a distribution side. But what's interesting is that Circle Films used to be a subsidiary of Circle Theaters, which was a movie theater chain based originally in Washington, D.C. So this is kind of interesting because we're seeing all three levels of filmmaking here, right? So Circle Theaters, they're obviously on the exhibition side, but then they also have sort of sister companies, the distribution company and just regular Circle Films, which is viewed as just a film company. And then they have the Releasing Corporation, sister company, which specifically does distribution. So that's who the Coens went through to get Blood Simple purchased and distributed and eventually shown theatrically. But when they decided to get moving on their second film, Raising Arizona, they actually turned to the production side of Circle Films, and they got the financing they needed from Circle Films to actually make the movie, to actually handle production costs. So this movie cost more than our first two of the semester. You can probably tell just by watching, but even by late 80s Hollywood standards, this was still a pretty cheap movie. I think they made it for around $5 million. Which of course is a lot of money to a normal person, but for a major motion picture, that's actually not a ton. But they got the financing from Circle Films, but here's what's interesting. With Blood Simple, they let Circle distribute it as well. But with Raising Arizona, perhaps sensing that they could do more with it, perhaps sensing a bigger money-making opportunity, or maybe because it was just sort of the next step in their evolution, they didn't go through Circle to distribute it. Well, I think actually Circle Films sold it, sold the movie to 20th Century Fox, which was one of the old Hollywood studios that stuck around even after the fall of the old classic Hollywood studio system. So, and a lot of the future Coen brother films would follow a similar path. Like when it comes to production, that would often be kind of independent. It would be handled by these sort of out-of-the-way companies. Later, they could sort of raise a lot of the money themselves, kind of that John Cassavetes model, where you sort of have your own money that you can use to finance your next big project. Once you get a certain level of successful, you can start doing that. Cassavetes was able to do it because he was an actor. And he took the money he made as a Hollywood actor and used it to get his indie films made, back before there was really a model or a pre-existing sort of precedent to do that. So the Coen brothers eventually kind of take different paths on the production side. They put up some money, they work with others, but when it comes to distribution, most of their films from this point on would be distributed by major studios or subsidiaries or like branches, arms of major studios. So, like I've been saying, this sometimes gets us into a debate as to whether or not we should even regard a movie like Raising Arizona as being independent, because it's ultimately the property of 20th Century Fox, one of the old studios. There's nothing really independent about going through 20th Century Fox, but they begin to work with Circle Films, which certainly exists largely outside of the Hollywood infrastructure. But these smaller companies are, if they're not under the umbrella of the big studios, they're at least doing business with the big studios, as we see here. And again, Pearson's talking about this last week, like, Cinecom, the company they sell Parting Glances to, it's kind of an indie setup, right? But it's been inspired or spun off from these pre-existing studio models, these like breakaway companies that are focused on art house and independent films. But even if they're separate from the studios, like I said, they're going to be doing business with the studios. They're going to be, working with them often at some level, whether it be production, distribution, or even exhibition. So we can't really totally get away from the Hollywood power structure, and we're going to see that more and more in the 90s with the rise of Miramax. Which has a very similar origin story to some of these other sort of subsidiaries or spin-off companies that we've been talking about. So we'll talk a lot more about Miramax as the semester goes on. But certainly I think even today, we still kind of identify the Coen brothers with independent filmmaking just because they have a very distinctive vision. They did sort of start out independent. And we just associate certain aspects of their style, their tone, with a kind of independent spirit, I think. So it's not always the most accurate or precise way of thinking about how their movies are getting made and distributed, but they still fall within these sort of indie parameters. And again, we'll talk about that with, some of the later directors that we get to. They may have only truly been independent for a short while, but we continue to associate them with independent filmmaking for a lot of reasons. Some good, some maybe less good, but we can sort of talk through a lot of those as we go along. So, okay, let's get to the movie itself. So like I was saying before, we can see a lot of their signature style beginning to emerge here in the late 80s. And we still think of this style in a lot of the same ways. So when we think of the Coen brothers, we often think quirky, funny. A lot of their films are comedies, or at least have elements of like dark humor. They might not be comedies first and foremost in every case, but they always have comedic moments. We think of them often as offbeat. We see a lot of eccentric, weird characters. This might remind us a little bit of Jarmusch. Again, we sort of think about a lot of independent filmmakers as sort of working with eccentric characters, offbeat situations, kind of off the beaten path. Sometimes we might say a bit zany, a little over the top, and I think we see that here with Raising Arizona. We're kind of turned up to a very high volume here. It can be a little cartoonish, a little over the top, satirical. Oftentimes they're poking fun at a lot of institutions, a lot of traditions that many viewers will be able to recognize, heavily stylized. Again, they have a distinctive style of their own, but they're also mashing up a lot of other things, other movie genres. They like to reference literature and other movies, so all of that's kind of at work as well. A lot of their movies are thought of as pretty visually compelling, somewhat innovative. Barry Sonnenfeld is the cinematographer. on this particular film, and he does the cinematography for a lot of their early films. He would later go on to be a director in his own right. I believe Sonnefeld's best known for doing the Men in Black movies. I think that's kind of where he made his bones. Also, smartly written. They're usually given credit for good, interesting, fun, witty screenplays. And we often see sort of lovable goofball characters. And I think we could look at H.I. or High, played by Nicolas Cage in this movie, as a prime example of sort of a Coen Brothers type character. He's kind of an outcast. He's kind of a misfit in certain ways. He doesn't conform to like regular society. He's a bit of a ne'er-do-well, right? I mean, he's a career criminal. When we first meet him, he's in and out of prison. All of that's kind of played for laughs initially. But maybe by the end of the movie, we do have perhaps some genuine affection for him. I think perhaps because of Cage, perhaps it's mostly just the way the character is written. I think eventually he sort of engenders some real pathos. He kind of has a sweet core. So again, this is true of a lot of their characters, kind of weird, eccentric people who don't fit. But they have a good heart. They mean well. They might be redeemed to a certain extent over the course of the film. So we can see the dude in The Big Lebowski as maybe falling along some similar lines. They have a lot of characters like this. But at the same time, we see some dark undercurrents in a lot of the Coen brothers films. They often blend comedy with violence and some kind of scary there's usually some scary stuff kind of maybe just beneath the surface, occasionally erupting. I don't think we see as much of that here as we might see in, say, Blood Simple or some of their more crime drama style films. This film is a comedy through and through. Kind of an absurdist comedy, I would argue. But there are some moments of violence, even if they're kind of played as being comical. The fight that breaks out between High and the John Goodman character, I think he's Gale. When they get into the fight, I'm always struck by that the extended chase scene involving the cop when High is on the run and he's running through the grocery store, he's running through the neighborhood, and the cop is shooting at him, and a lot of other people start to shoot at him. And there's always that sort of loud sound effect of the gun, particularly the cop's gun, as he sort of shows up in these improbable places and he's shooting at High. And again, it's all played for comedy. It's all kind of over the top, zany, madcap, kind of ridiculous, but that loud gunfire noise and just the fact that this is kind of a violent sequence, right? I mean, we don't see blood. High eventually gets away. But there's, all this gunplay in the grocery store. People are screaming. The Coen brothers often do that, right? They tap into real violence and at times, moments of real, like, menace and unease. Again, if you've ever seen No Country for Old Men, they really create a suspenseful, sort of almost a sort of feeling of dread over the course of that film. There are moments of humor there, but it's a very different tone. It's a very different register, and violence kind of can erupt at any moment in that world. But even in Fargo, we see a little bit of that. They often blend comedy with violence, sort of over-the-top, absurd hijinks with like real danger and real menace. And people have commented on that juxtaposition, how it creates some interesting effects. I think they're definitely playing around with it here. They're still kind of perfecting it. But again, if you look at Miller's Crossing, Fargo, Blood Simple, No Country for Old Men, these are all very violent films. They're very, very violent. The characters in these films are very violent. I wouldn't classify Raising Arizona with those necessarily in terms of violence, but we see some shades, we see some moments of that here. But in a lot of ways, it's kind of emblematic of a lot of the independent movies that were coming out in the 80s, especially the ones being made by young filmmakers. Maybe a bit rough around the edges in some ways, perhaps not fully realized or developed, not a complete portrait of the filmmaker's sort of full artistic vision or the full range of the filmmaker's artistic abilities. In a lot of ways, I kind of look at Raising Arizona this way. I think it's a good film. I don't think it's one of the Coen brothers' best films. I don't. But I think it's interesting as sort of like an early draft. They're working things out. They're figuring out their style. So it's kind of giving us a glimpse into what they would do later. A lot of their key interests, a lot of the motifs and themes that they would return to in later films. Also, the parts of the visual style, aspects of the characters that they write, some of the actors that they cast to play those characters. So they're kind of creating templates and sort of signposts, I think, for them to use later as their careers really take off, as their shared career really takes off. So, but again, I would come back to the point that we can't reduce the brothers to just one style or one mode of filmmaking. Like I said, they work in this kind of old-timey film noir mode when it comes to Blood Simple and some of their later stuff. And for those of you who don't know, film noir was just sort of a blanket term given to a lot of American films from the 30s, 40s, up through the 50s that often featured crime to some extent, like Private Eyes, gangsters, often femme fatales, often a fair amount of violence, intrigue, suspense, action. But, popular films, it's kind of a broad term. It can refer to a lot of different kinds of films. But they were often in black and white. They often were kind of hard-boiled. There was some kind of hard-boiled private eye and a beautiful woman that he's pursuing or trying to solve the mystery surrounding her or whatever. They kind of had a particular style and a lot of similar subject matter in a lot of those films. So they're making what, originally with Blood Simple, they were making what came to be known as neo-noirs. Back in the 80s, there was kind of a film noir renaissance, or a sort of a comeback of sorts, and a lot of people started doing those style of movies again, kind of hard-bitten, hard-boiled crime dramas, often featuring, a heist or cops doing this or that. Sometimes the focus could be on criminals. Sometimes the focus would be more on the law, trying to stop those criminals. But a lot of the similar character types, and again, a lot of the same kind of visual cues, similar lighting, similar set design, smoke-filled rooms, rain-soaked streets. You guys have probably seen some of those, or at least you've seen images or certain tropes that get recycled from those kinds of movies. So the Coens like to work in that milieu, right? They've done several neo-noirs throughout their career. I would argue Miller's Crossing was another. He was in color, but again, similar in a lot of ways. Blood Simple is very much a film noir, just sort of transported to the 80s and set in small town Texas. But it's very much indebted to that older style of filmmaking. And they also enjoy the Western. Again, I mentioned True Grit, The Ballad of Buster Scruggs. So they can work within that established old Hollywood genre as well. So again, a little bit like Jarmusch. They have a lot in common with Jarmusch, I think. Their movies aren't really similar, but just in terms of artistic sort of vision and kind of how they genre hop. Jarmusch also likes to sometimes do some film noir stuff. He's used the Western genre, kind of put his own spin on it. So the indie filmmakers of this generation, a lot of them are sort of wired this way. They're such they're so steeped in movie lore and movie history that they can easily sort of adopt or imitate old, established, sort of classic Hollywood genres, like crime dramas, like the Western. But that's not all they do, right? So sometimes the Coens are doing that. No Country for Old Men, that's a Western, kind of a modern Western. So they can imitate certain genres. But then at other times, like Jarmusch, I would argue, is doing with Stranger Than Paradise, they're just sort of doing their own thing, sort of making a genre-busting movie, a movie that's sort of hard to classify or categorize using our traditional film genres, because they're kind of mashups of a lot of different things. And I think we see that with Raising Arizona. Again, it's a sort of over-the-top, almost cartoonish comedy, but there are sort of aspects of crime drama imported in here, right? With some of the characters, the schemes that get cooked up, stealing the baby, chase sequences, being on the wrong side of the law. So the Coens are doing a lot of different things here, and they're pulling from a lot of different sources. But at its core, I kind of look at this movie as, I don't know, it is sort of a love story, but it's sort of an absurdist take on a very classic couple of American characters. So again, Nick Cage here plays the ne'er-do-well, the sort of misfit type character that we've already mentioned, often shows up in Coen Brothers films. But then we have Holly Hunter as Ed, playing sort of the good-natured but stern, morally upright woman who the ne'er-do-well sort of madcap man needs in order to fly right and to sort of focus his manic energy on good things, like starting a family and living a more sort of conventional, all-American type existence. So, again, they're playing with certain tropes, with certain archetypes, certain character types that are very familiar to viewers. Even if we can't exactly put our finger on, okay, where have I seen this type of character before, they're just sort of vaguely familiar to us. And this movie is very much riffing on a lot of things that are kind of vaguely familiar to us. Just sort of these notions of like Americana. A lot of aspects of American popular culture kind of show up here. Sometimes they're being satirized or kind of poked fun at. But other times they're just kind of part of the atmosphere. They're part of this world. It's not really, I wouldn't call it a realistic world. Sometimes the Coen brothers, I think, do strive for a certain level of realism. Not so much in this film. We seem to be existing in kind of a slightly alternate reality where everything's a little bit, again, absurd, sort of over the top, zany, kind of crazy, but we do recognize a lot of things. And a lot of critics picked this up, right away. They talked about how the film seems to be talking, at least in some ways, about the West, about the American West, as it sort of exists in our imaginations. A place of, great opportunity, wide open spaces, a place where you can sort of find a new life. That is kind of what High is doing. Again, this is a very common storyline or basic plot to have this sort of low rent, small time criminal trying to turn his life around with the help of, this good woman trying to start a family and make an honest living. But again, that's the story, but I'm not sure how seriously we're always intended to take it. But by the end, I do think we kind of want High and Ed to make it. We do sort of appreciate their gesture at the end. We're hopeful for their future. I don't know. The Coens have a knack, and this is partly, I think, what a lot of people like about their films. They can, again, they can combine different tones, different registers. Sort of over-the-top slapstick comedy along with genuine pathos and tugging on the emotional heartstrings, and then they might scare you or make you nervous in a scene. They can just do a lot of sort of not only genre shifting, but shifting tone, shifting register, and shifting audience reaction and overall effect. But yeah, there's this sort of theme of the West running through here in some way. I think it's up to us to articulate it, but it's definitely present. This idea of frontiersmen, exploration, adventure, with everything sort of cranked up to 11, but there's a scene, I think it's around the 1 hour mark. It's after that long chase sequence, and Ed finally picks up High, and they're going back to their house, and they're sort of frazzled after this run-in with the law, and she's upset with him for getting them into this mess, and he sort of explains, or tries to offer an explanation. It's, again, mostly played for laughs, but he says, I come from a long line of frontiersmen and outdoor types, which is a funny line. The outdoor types edition is funny. But again, even though it's a little bit of a throwaway line, it kind of matters, right? He kind of, even though he's a ridiculous character, and we might not take him super seriously, he kind of envisions himself that way, as a frontiersman, somebody who adventures and, takes on these kind of quests. And that is kind of what they do. They undertake this big mission. It's obviously morally suspect, but they're not like malicious, villainous people. So we feel comfortable rooting for them, even though they're misguided. High obviously gets into all kinds of trouble. And it's all sort of good fun, for the most part. And again, in some of their other movies, they would do more mixing of the good fun with terrifying violence and legitimate danger. Here, I think we remain in a more sort of upbeat, fun register by and large, although I will point out a couple of moments where we might sort of veer into some darker territory. But just to finish the point about sort of how their style is coalescing here, how the Coen brothers are kind of bringing together all these different elements. So yeah, they're definitely influenced by older movies, particularly the work of Preston Sturges, who was a writer-director in Hollywood, mostly in the 30s and 40s. It's okay if you're not familiar with him. I'm not super familiar with him. I've only seen one of his films, but he was well known as the maker of what were called screwball comedies back in the 30s and 40s. Some of you might have seen some of these at some point, but they were, old comedies that were sort of renowned for, they usually centered around relationships, sort of improbable relationships. And they usually featured a lot of witty repartee, like rapid fire, sort of witty one-liners flying, but also a lot of physical comedy. Like various pratfalls and, getting hit by stuff. So they were popular during those decades, and the Coen brothers really like those movies. They really like Sturges. They like this sort of fast-paced nature of his plots, the way he writes. Again, he often features some kind of ridiculous situations, various hijinks, but ultimately, the sort of emotional core of a lot of his movies are just, they're love stories, these sort of improbable pairings, and we're watching to see if they'll work out. A lot of modern movies borrow heavily from that old genre, and they just kind of subtract some of the physical comedy maybe, and some of the tone down the writing, because those movies today might be considered a little bit talky, too talky. But that was kind of a big part of the appeal. So the only movie by Sturges that I've ever seen is The Lady Eve, which is pretty well known. It came out in 1941. It's often on like those AFI, best 100 movies of all time, starring Henry Fonda, Barbara Stanwyck. It's the kind of movie that like your grandparents might have liked a lot. Like, it was popular in that my grandparents, maybe y'all's grandparents are younger than mine, but it was popular for that era. Again, known for the razor sharp writing and the sort of romantic comedy stylings of Sturges. So the Coens are kind of borrowing a little bit from that. But like Kevin Smith acknowledges in Pearson's book, for a lot of modern viewers who maybe didn't watch a lot of golden era Hollywood cinema or European art cinema, all of these older influences, sometimes we're just getting that stuff filtered through the likes of Jarmusch and the Coen brothers. So the Coens like to sort of show off their influences, and they like to reference the stuff that they like, But I think from our perspective today, and since Sturgis is so old and not really popular amongst people today outside of really hardcore film nerds or upper level film students, right, the Sturgis influence, it just kind of becomes a part of the Coen style, right? Because a lot of us, we don't know Sturgis, we just know how the Coens have used Sturgis in a lot of their films. Another thing they're using here in particular, and I think they use it in other films as well, is a pretty healthy dose of Southern literature, particularly Flannery O'Connor and William Faulkner. Also the Bible, too, probably, but they're very much influenced by O'Connor here. Just the whole kind of atmosphere and these characters that are weird, sometimes kind of grotesque in various ways. I think we can see the O'Connor influence, a little bit of dark humor as well. And then with Faulkner, it's a little bit more subtle, but we see Faulkner here, I think, in the John Goodman and William Forsythe characters, Gale and Evel Snopes. So Faulkner often would feature sort of low-life, rural, like redneck characters with no more artful way to put it, but just sort of, those weren't usually the focal points of a lot of his fiction, but if you've read a lot of Faulkner, you probably have come across the Snopes family. So Snopes and Faulkner, Snopes here in the film, obviously that's an homage, that's a callback to Faulkner, but the Snopes were just these sort of low-life guys, this family that had sort of made some money in a very disreputable way, but they were sort of looked down upon by the other people in town because they were sort of, they were liars, cheaters, kind of small-time criminals. They were not viewed as morally sound people. So clearly, I think, they're kind of riffing on those characters in Faulkner and sort of using them at least as a partial basis for Gale and Evel, who are kind of good-natured in their way, but they're obviously crooked, and they ultimately betray High and steal the baby for themselves. So all of those influences are at work. I don't think it's terribly important that you guys are familiar with all of those source materials, but just be aware that the Coens are drawing from a lot of literature, a lot of old film. But again, for us, a lot of these aspects might just become part of the Coen brothers' very distinctive style, which has come a long way probably since 1987. Again, this is like an early draft for them. They're still working it all out. I think the movie, Raising Arizona, this movie, is a little bit uneven, drags at times. I think they get better, but they're trying on a lot of things for size, and a lot of these character types and certain ideas about America or certain kind of American mythology will continue to be of interest for them in future films. And again, we're set in Arizona here, which again is important, right? I mean, our geography, I think, matters. Holly Hunter is sort of doing a deep South accent. The actress herself is from Georgia. So I would almost argue that while it is set in the Southwest, they're drawing on Southern literature, Western mythology, old Hollywood screwball comedies, a lot of disparate things, but they come together in a pretty nice stew here, and it sort of works despite being profoundly weird. And again, that's kind of partly what we like about the Coens, how we identify their films as sort of delightfully weird and offbeat. But just to think a little bit about some of the technical aspects, again, think about the cinematography from Sonnenfeld. We have a pretty active moving camera here. A lot of dramatic zoom-ins, at times almost a chaotic feel, especially during that chase sequence. But it's kind of a nice mixture between some of the fast-moving, frenetic stuff and a more stately style that we see at times with plenty of traditional long and medium shots and more traditional setups. Also, notice the set design. Let's not forget about those various aspects of mise-en-scene, right? Think about set design, think about costumes and hair, which I think are important here. They go a long way towards creating this kind of unique, odd, kind of fun, but a little bit squalid at times, but mostly fun and kind of zany atmosphere. And again, somewhat cartoonish even at times. So there's a lot to consider. We can also consider the acting, which I think is interesting, an interesting thing to analyze here. So Cage nowadays is often thought of as maybe a bit of a punchline or a meme. I know a lot of people sort of find him maybe unintentionally funny. He can still remind us at times that he's a capable, serious actor. He was certainly considered back in the late 80s, for the most part, to still be a serious actor. But I think we can see some of the things on display here that he is often mocked for. Maybe a tendency to overact a little bit, his tendency to play a lot of sort of manic, twitchy guys. And I think that's kind of true of his character here. But I've always felt like he kind of plays high. He plays them pretty well and almost in kind of an understated way. I think, yeah, there are some cartoonish, over-the-top aspects to the character, but he also kind of has a bit of a deadpan, droll demeanor at times. And considering all the zany things that are going on around him, I actually think Cage often sort of goes with kind of an understated method. Maybe he doesn't do that so much anymore, but he's still pretty early in his acting career here. So I think he's a pretty good fit for the role, but the sort of gossip on set was that he did not get along well with the Coen brothers, so I don't think he's appeared in any of their other films. However, some of the other cast members here are frequent collaborators with the Coens. John Goodman shows up in a lot of their movies. He has a small but pitch-perfect supporting role here. And Holly Hunter, who plays Ed, she also turns up in at least one other film from them, maybe two others. I can remember her being in Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? And I want to say she was in another one as well. But I think she's really good, too. She's kind of more the anchor, long regarded as a very versatile actor. Later in 1987, she would hit it big with the film Broadcast News, which made more money, I think, at the box office probably than Raising Arizona. It was a much bigger sort of production, starring, I think, William Hurt was in that, Albert Brooks. Talk about generational tastes. My parents like that movie a lot. They watched that movie when they were sort of young adults. So late 80s, very much about the TV world. It's set at a TV station. Anyway, that made her famous. That movie got her famous. A lot of people kind of forget about her role in the other film she did from 87 right here. But yeah, she would turn up in a lot of big movies later in the 90s. The Piano was one. So she's pretty well known, and John Goodman shows up in a lot of Coen Brothers films. He's in Oh Brother, he's in Inside Llewyn Davis, I believe. He's in Barton Fink, which is one of my favorites. I didn't mention that one earlier. That comes out in 91. And Goodman plays a serial killer in that film who may or may not be some kind of incarnation of Satan. So Barton Fink, in some ways, would give us kind of a better sense of how the Coens would later come to blend comedy with almost horror elements, or again, a lot of suspense, a lot of darkness that would surface in some of their other work. And we see a little bit of it here, I would argue. We see a little bit of violence from High when he punches out, their couple friends who, he punches out the guy, I guess his boss, as we learn, who proposes some kind of swinger arrangement. So we see a little bit of menace from an otherwise goofball character right there. And I would argue that when Evil and Gale first show up, there's a little bit of menace there. A lot of it's conveyed by John Goodman. I mean, he's like the perfect character actor for the Coens because he can shift tones and registers so deftly. He can be gregarious, funny, really welcoming and generous and what at one moment, and then he can sort of switch and become very menacing, very frightening with his large physique, and his the sort of power that it portends. He can really make that switch. If you've seen Oh Brother, you might know what I'm talking about. If you ever watch Barton Fink, you can see that even in The Big Lebowski, right? He plays kind of an unstable character. So we laugh at the character. He has funny lines. He does funny stuff, but he's also kind of violent and unstable. So we're a little bit on a razor's edge at times when it comes to how we're supposed to feel about the character, how the character, what kind of response the character elicits from us. I think the Coens are really good at that. And when they first show up kind of uninvited at the house, High's trying to be generous, trying to welcome them, be a good host. Obviously, Ed wants them gone. But during that sort of early, I think when they first get there and they're sort of questioning, like, why was the baby somewhere else? Oh, we thought your parents were dead, High. There's this sense that they're finding out that something's amiss. We don't trust them. They try to recruit High to, rob a bank or something, but then they end up sort of turning on him. So there is that element, even though, again, almost everything here is kind of played for laughs and is sort of treated as cartoonish, buffoonish frequently. And obviously, Evel and Gale are very buffoonish, and the way they end up is very comical. But there are those moments, and also the bounty hunter character and the sort of menace that he brings. Again, it's sort of satirical. It's supposed to be kind of silly, but there's a little bit of fear, perhaps, mixed in there, a little bit of a nightmarish quality mixed in there, and they would definitely tap into that a lot more with a lot of their future films. So I'd be interested to know how you guys feel about this film, especially if you've seen some of the Coen brothers' more recent work. It would be nice to do some comparison this week in our discussion post if you have a few other Coen brother films that you've seen, that you like. Again, does this movie sort of give you a sense of what they were building towards? Like, do you see this movie as like a foundational, a building block as they created their signature style? Or does this movie seem very different from some of their other work that you might be familiar with? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. Okay, so we'll keep this lecture a little bit shorter than our previous couple, and I will sign off. I'll see you guys next week for the week 4 lecture. Just a quick reminder, if you are watching this early in the week, we're going to try another film screening here in week 3. I'm going to try to do it on campus in Winnemucca on Wednesday. I think it might work better there. I will send everybody the invite. We'll try to do it again through Zoom, and hopefully the results are better. All right, email me if you have any questions, and I will see you next week.